Thanks so much for being with Morning Live. Now, there's been much reaction following the appointment of the 12 non-executive members of the SABC Board by President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday. The 12 appointments include Khathutshelo Ramukumba, who has been appointed as the chairperson of the board, while Nomvuyiso Batyi will serve as the deputy chairperson. Ramaphosa came under heavy criticism for the delay in appointing the board, with accusations of political interference, particularly after it was revealed that the former Communications Minister, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, wrote to the Communications Portfolio Committee about the inclusion of former head of news, Phathiswa Magopeni. Now, Media Monitoring Africa Director William Bird joins us now virtually to have a further discussion about this. William, good morning. Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the program.
So the board has finally been appointed, albeit 6 months after the term of the previous board ended in October last year. But just in terms of your first reaction, now that you've had a chance to, I suppose, think about it a little bit more, what are your thoughts on what we are seeing now?
Well, first, it's just a huge sigh of relief that the board has finally been appointed. And I mean, obviously, it's 6 months. It's an extraordinarily long time, and it's something that we can't ever allow to occur again. But, you know, the board's got to hit the ground running. I've already heard the chair's been on interviews with people. I'm imagining that they'll be convening as soon as they possibly can in order to start to deal with the multiplicity of crises that I'm sure they're going to be facing. You know, they've got to get a handle on what's actually going on at the SABC. They've got to sort themselves out as a board, and then they've got to deal with some really significant and challenging issues.
So before we look at what the board, would be faced with, let's just look at the SABC in the past 6 months and, of course, the sort of prejudice that the organization would have suffered as a result of not having a board, William.
Well, I mean, there are a huge number of things. We saw, the senior executives being chewed out at a SCOPA meeting, which is really not fair. And the senior executives, because this is not a crisis of their making, but entirely of Parliament and the President. So we've seen them being put under huge pressure. And of course, everyone who works at the SABC, operating for 6 months without a board, there's all this, well, what's going to happen now? Are we, when is the new board going to come in? Are our jobs secure? What's going to happen with the SABC? Is it financially sustainable? There are all sorts of really legitimate questions that people have about what's going to happen. They're worried about levels of interference. They're worried about, meetings with the minister. And then you've got the added issue of some of the senior executives' terms coming to an end. And that would weigh heavily on everyone's mind. So I think that's one of the most direct impacts that we don't talk about. That said, SABC, like every other entity in the country, has also had to deal with the fallout from load shedding. And load shedding is huge, not just in terms of the consequence for people and power, but it means you lose audience every time there's load shedding. And that itself has a consequence. Why? Because it impacts advertisers. Advertisers during load shedding have less money. So the financial position for the SABC is pretty dire. And that is one of the big consequences. They also then have had, a minister previously deciding for them on what's going to be the answer for the analog switch off. And that's going to be a big issue that the SABC is going to have to deal with almost immediately.
So, speaking of that, this appointment, of course, comes during the month of April, when many changes generally kick in here at the SABC due to the new financial year. But what would be some of the priorities, William, that the SABC board should focus on right now?
Well, I think priority number one will be getting a handover from the senior team, find out what's been going on. They'll have to get to grips with the board handover report that was presented or that was left lying on their desks for them in October last year. They'll have to see what of those things are still live. Some of them may still be. So I think it'll be getting a handle on contracts. That'll be one of the first things to get a handle on what the SABC's financial position is. And then start to see what are the next things in terms of two of the executives are leaving, and they're going to need to start almost immediately advertising for those because of the fact that you've got so much pressure. You can't possibly leave a period where you've got two senior people just not there to do their job. And then I think they're going to have to start looking at the issue of the analog switch off as another priority. And then, of course, they're going to start to say, well, elections are coming. The electioneering is already starting. We're going to need to make sure that we're well prepared and that the SABC is sufficiently well resourced in order to cover the elections freely and fairly. And I think their final priority for now would be to reassert the critical importance and independence of the public broadcaster. We're going to need a board to come in and say, okay, we're here, we're there now, and we've got everyone at the SABC's backs. Anyone who's got any issue with the SABC or whatever, you talk to us. You don't talk to our team, you talk to us.
And that, of course, is a critical point, as you say, with the elections coming up next year, a critical election. And, of course, political interference has always been a big bugbear for the SABC because this is contested terrain for obvious reasons. And I was thinking of Michael Markowitz, for example, a previous board member who put out a tweet talking about the independence of the SABC following a meeting between the Minister of Communications and his team and the SABC executives. And that, seemed to raise some eyebrows. And he questioned the fact that the communications department, for example, had unfettered access to the SABC executives. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you've had a scenario where you've put the SABC senior executive team in a completely impossible position. That there's no one for the minister, etc., to speak to and engage with. They can appear in Parliament, obviously, on some level, but not to answer questions for the board. And so they were then seen as the proxy, and they got criticized strongly for that, even though this is not a crisis of their making. But what it certainly did do was allow that level of access to the board. We saw those posts of the minister meeting, including the head of news, etc., and that really shouldn't be happening. You need that clear break and division from them so that the board can be there to deal with that kind of level of engagement, because you don't want ministers, etc., meeting with them on that basis, and certainly not with the head of news, unless there's a very particular reason why that should be the case, and that's clearly in board sanctioned. Otherwise I can't see why on earth you would be engaging with them, particularly given the importance of the independence of the SABC.
And, as I was saying, this is, of course, a highly contested space. So how can the SABC go about insulating itself from political interference, from bullying tactics? Because it is the public broadcaster, and some of those who are in powerful positions think that they can abuse that power at a whim when it comes to this particular platform.
I mean, it is subject to that, you being the very one of the very clear targets of that kind of level of bullying and abuse. The short answer is the journalists must keep doing what they're doing. You must go in there and ask hard questions, hold people accountable. If people have an issue, there's the Broadcast Complaints Commission and there's the SABC's own internal complaints process. That's how people need to deal with issues. For them to be going around and trying to threaten and do all of those sorts of things is completely and utterly inappropriate and completely unacceptable. So part of that needs to be that we've seen already the head of SABC News has clearly admonished those who tried to make those kinds of threats against you and other SABC journalists. But we now need the board to come in and clearly and unambiguously stamp their level of independence and say, no, anyone who has an issue, you will have to raise strategic concerns with us. If you've got a complaint about a journalist or any particular news item or whatever it may be, there's the BCCSA or here's the SABC's internal complaints process. Otherwise, we're not interested.
So, William, as a party, as Media Monitoring Africa, that went to court to force the president to make this appointment, now that he has appointed the board, the same names that were provided by Parliament, what is your way forward as Media Monitoring Africa? Will you be proceeding with legal action or not, and why or why not?
So there are a couple of issues. One of the issues is that the president appointed, we suggested that he would appoint 11 of the names because Franz Kruger, as you're well aware, pulled out of the original nominations process, which meant that he then used that so-called reserve pool. So that's an issue that we're currently looking at from a legal perspective. The second thing, and this is what we're still considering with our legal team, is that when we went to the Constitutional Court, we were essentially asking for two things. One, for the court to compel the president to appoint the board immediately. That he has done finally. And the second thing was to issue an order saying that the president had not acted with diligence and without delay. And in that regard, we're still busy consulting with our lawyers, and we'll see to what extent we are going to take that forward.
And of what importance is that in order to try and prevent this from ever happening again? Because it's not as if this was a surprise. We all know now that this board has been appointed, in 5 years' time, its term would have run out. So we should know what the timeframes are and how to move on from there. And this speaks, I suppose, not just to the president, but also to Parliament in terms of the delay that came about.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the clearest problem with where we are. We're in a deep crisis for the SABC, which is really unfair on everyone involved. And that's been entirely engineered. Well, I don't know about deliberately, but certainly Parliament's failure to act in time well in advance, so that they should have had the board, they should have done the interviews, because they knew that the board's term was coming to an end. They'd known for 5 years. How they failed to do that in time is anyone's guess, and certainly Parliament deserves strong sanction for that particular aspect of the delay. And then the president, going around and then delaying for a further 4 months is also, we believe, completely unacceptable. And that's one of the reasons why I think we're still considering the legal action, because it isn't just about the fact that the board needed to be appointed. It's about there needs to be some level of accountability for the simple fact that Parliament and the presidency failed the SABC and they failed South Africa.
And just finally, William, in terms of some of the decisions that had been taken, for example, if the SABC had said while negotiating new contracts for its employees that we can't give you an increase, for example, because the board has not been appointed. What does that mean now? Are you able to go back and retrospectively address that particular matter? And I would imagine that's just one issue. There may be some other contractual obligations that may have been undertaken during this time. Would those be up for review? Would the board have to look at those? And again, can they be looked at retrospectively if someone feels aggrieved about it?
Well, I imagine they're going to have to get a handle on all of the various contracts. We know, for example, that in the Scopa hearing, the COO, when he appeared, said there are a number of contracts that we simply can't take any movement on because these require the approval of the board. So I think depending on what that is and the nature of those contracts, the board will have to review it and see whether or not they can then go back and say, this is the case. If they find that senior executives signed on a contract that they shouldn't have, then they'll have to, look into that and decide what action, if any, they can take in regard to that particular contract. But we've got no reason to suspect, for all the crazy things that happen at the SABC on a regular basis, that there have been governance rules and procedures flouted by the senior team. We haven't seen any media reports, at least that I'm aware of, that have suggested that they've been going on and signing on contracts when they really shouldn't have or haven't had permission. So I think the first thing for the board is to get a handle on what those contracts are and what they need to do about them.
Well, thanks so much, William Bird, for your input this morning. Media Monitoring Africa Director William Bird on the appointment of the SABC Board by President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday. Well, you're always welcome to let us know what your thoughts are on this and, of course, our question of the day as well at Morning Live SABC.